Okay, a very good afternoon to everyone and all NLBians. Hello and welcome everyone to another NLB's PixelStudio online training session. Today we are going to show you how you can use Zoom webinar to conduct your online programs and virtual classroom sessions. My name is Indra from PixelStudio TDS and I'll be your session manager for today. Before we start with the session, let me share with you who is with me today, okay? Your trainer for today is Mr. Roger Xia. Roger is a project manager from TDS and a member of PixelStudio. Roger runs innovation projects as well as conducting R&D on some of the new innovation initiative for NLB. Currently, he's working on gamification projects and will be managing the upcoming black box competitions. So look out for that. It's coming your way soon. With us today, we also have Hafiz and Ryan, who will be the moderator for today's Zoom session. And so I think that's all for me. So without further ado, let's start the webinar session and I hand over the session to Roger, who will spend around like 45 minutes showing you the Zoom webinar functions. Take it away, Rog. It's all yours.
Thanks, Indra. Okay, let me just share my slides. All right, everyone, this is the introduction and demonstration to Zoom webinar. We will be proceeding shortly, but before that, for those of you guys in the audiences, take note that on your devices, if you're coming in on a mobile phone or on a web browser, that you can actually put down your questions in the Q&A button on the client itself. Look for the Q&A button once again. We would really appreciate if you guys can ask your questions through this button instead of raising your hands or private messaging the panelists today, which is either Ryan or Hafiz, or for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can leave down a comment if you have any questions that you want to ask. But the general idea is that put down your questions in this Q&A button and we'll go through them if I can. So the controls for this Zoom webinar might be slightly different from what you have seen before. If you have attended a Zoom meeting before, this is completely new. It's just that there are a few buttons extra, so don't worry about it. As always, you can have your raise hand function if you must have something to say, then do raise your hands in those cases and we'll hand that to you. Like I mentioned, the introduction and demonstration to Zoom webinar, we've just gotten the license to use Zoom webinar. And we are discovering a lot of usefulness with this software that we want to share with you guys today. For today's agenda, I'll be going through these three main points, which is the comparison between a normal Zoom meeting and a Zoom webinar meeting. Afterwards, I'll spend a little bit of time to tell you how to manage and host your own webinars, and then to have a practice and support session if we have the time. All right. Okay, so moving on, what is the difference between a Zoom meeting and a Zoom webinar? So for a Zoom webinar, as you might have noticed, the default settings for attendees, which is you guys in the audience, is placing you guys in only a listen and view mode. You would realize very quickly that you don't have a lot of privileges compared to a normal Zoom meetings. You can't really speak, you can't really share your screen. You're really only participating in a listen and view mode. And only the host can see this participation list, unless of course I allow you guys to see who is in this webinar. You guys will remain largely anonymous, and your identity will only be known if you approach the panelists individually. All right. Compared to a Zoom meetings where you are able to share your content, you can share an audio, share a video. It's less interactive. Why is this so? Why would there be a different need for such a meeting? For a Zoom meeting, it's more ideal for an interactive session, as mentioned before. If you only have, say, small to large group, about 2 to maybe 10. The roles in these Zoom meetings will be the host, the co-host, and the participants. However, compared to a webinar, it's more ideal for large audiences and events that are open to the public where typically you don't interact with one another. Zoom webinars are designed so that the host or any designated panelist, which is for our case, the PixelStudio members, we can share our video, we can share our audio and screen, but you guys do not. The only way that you can interact with us would be through the Q&A and the chat. So the roles differ by having an additional panelist and attendee. So this is a friendly chart that I've drafted out for your benefit. Right now, we are having a Zoom webinar session. I'm the host. I have my co-host. My co-host plays the roles of the presenter or the moderator, and you guys are in the attendee in these Zoom meetings. Using the Q&A, you approach and interact with us. If you're coming in from social media channels, for example, our YouTube channel or live or Facebook, for example, you can leave comments on those respective social media channels and get in touch with us. But this is the general idea. I hope you understand. So moving on, I want to quickly move on to how you can create your own webinar and how you can brand it up such as it's yours. So there are many wonderful benefits of the webinar we will get into shortly and how to set it up. But first, you have to understand that that creating your webinar basically is split into two parts. The first part will be how you can manage your webinar, how you set it up, how you schedule it, and how you customize it. The second part will be about hosting your webinar, what I'm doing right now, what are the roles available to you, how you can manage your Q&A, and what kind of reports or statistic can you generate from such a webinar. So the first thing about creating your own webinar will be how to schedule and register. I'm sure a lot of you guys today have come in via a form of registration form that I've created. I'll show you in a moment how to get that started, but essentially there are a lot of pointers here, and if you want, you can refer to the link that I'll be providing you guys to refer to, but I would like to touch on 4 major pointers on scheduling and setting up your own webinars. Right, the first is whether it's a recurring or non-recurring webinars, meaning are you planning to do it every day of the week for the next month, or just once every month, or just one time? This is something that you have to take note. The second point is if you're, say, conducting a normal meeting and you wish to convert it into a webinar, this is also possible. In a Zoom meeting as well, you can designate alternative host. For example, I'm the main host of this meeting. Indra will be my alternative host. In the case of anything happens to me, Indra can easily take over this Zoom webinar. And lastly, the registration for meetings. Right, I'll just briefly divert your attention on how you can register and create your own Zoom webinar, right? So I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this Zoom registration form with our own branding designated. Let me just show you how it looks like from my end. Okay, so this would be the Zoom page itself, or we will call it the admin page. You must have a license account to see the settings and see this page. So once you have a license account for Zoom, scheduling a webinar will be as easily as tapping this button, schedule a webinar. So once you schedule a webinar, you are brought to the settings page for your webinar, where you can actually put in stuff like, okay, for example, what topic you want, and the description if you so choose to, a time and date for the webinar, the duration of the webinar, the time zone, and earlier, as I mentioned, whether it's a recurring or one-time affair, right? So in terms of recurrence, you can set daily, repeat every day, end date, or how many occurrences. Different webinars will differ differently. If you are wanting to have a registration in your Zoom webinar, you can just check registered, required, set a password for your webinar, a video for your host and panelists on and off, and audio settings. For these settings, you can just leave it on default. Don't worry about them for now. These are the options that I wanted to highlight to you guys. Do you want Q&A in your webinar? Do you want to enable practice session, or only authenticated users can join in or record? I'll go into these settings as we go on in the presentation later on. Don't worry about them too much. Just know that for now, these are good settings that you should set by default. So for me, for this Zoom webinar, I'll have the Q&A on so that you guys can interact with me. I'll enable a practice session so that I can rehearse before I actually start. And my alternative host for this Zoom webinar will be Indra. So you can just input Indra's information here. So I'll show you now the settings for my Zoom webinar. So this is the Zoom demonstration by PixelStudio, description as such, and alternative host will be Indra, my password, my webinar options. Say, for example, if you require registration for your Zoom webinar, over here you can see, hey, you actually can further customize your invitation. For example, I have two tracking links here. One will be from SOE, which was the EDM that was pumped to you guys. So I can track from this simple registration link how many registered viewers and how many visitors on my page. Say for example, if I want to create another marketing link on Facebook, it will be just as simple as clicking add, then I'll put Facebook, and then the system gives me a link that I can copy and paste in Facebook to market my event. So this is something that you can easily do. And then you can track how many visitors are coming to your event or getting to know about your event from Facebook instead of from the normal SOE EDMs. For now, for this Zoom webinars, I've set it to automatically approve any registrations. So in fact, all of you guys that have kindly registered for this webinar, your approval is actually done automatically. Of course, I have the options to go back and edit so that I can only approve once you guys registered manually each registration. So this is going to take me a lot of time. For now, I just set it to automatically approve. But as always, the settings is there for you. So that's about it for the registration page. Say you want to make this your very own webinar. You want to brand it differently. So under branding, you can set, hey, you want a nice banner that has the NLB logo. You have your title page. You want to have additional logos or speaker information. You can add them in here as well. All of these settings are fully customizable. If you're interested, more details will be in the links. If, say, for example, you want to add poll, at the very start of the beginning, you guys helped me in answering a very quick poll. This is also added when you're scheduling an event. You can also see and review the results of your poll. Live streaming. We are currently live streaming on our PixelStudio YouTube page. So this is where you come and set the settings for the streaming services, say that you might wish to be subscribed to. So that's about it for scheduling your webinar. It's very simply just click of buttons. Don't worry if you are a bit overwhelmed. Let me see if we have any questions coming in now. From Pei Ling Tay, can we know how many devices will the host be required to have in order to run a successful webinar? So if you're the host, normally you don't take charge of the entire webinar by yourself. If you're only one person, you would usually have a panelist with you to run the whole webinar. I will refer to the diagram that I've drafted up for you guys. So you're the host, you have your speakers, your presenter as your co-host or your panelists. You guys will form the whole committee for this webinar. So you only really need one device, which is your internet device, to host this meeting, and then you can assign roles in this meeting. So if you ask me how many devices would you need, I would say one is enough. Another question is by Lim Lilian. Are we given access to use this account for our public programs? So again, if you are very interested in webinars after today's demonstration, you can approach your individual department heads about the license. As I mentioned earlier, you do need a pro license to use this Zoom webinar. The normal Zoom meetings, if you can see over here, are free of charge. You can sign in, but of course, there's a cap on the duration of the meeting itself and the number of participants. If you're interested in Zoom webinar, this is the plan and pricing. Right now, we have the pro license for Zoom webinar. That's why we can have webinars up to 100 participants. If you want to go into a business license, which I will explain later on, the difference between business and pro is that they're actually providing a live transcribing services. So if you go back later and attend this webinar and you watch it, you can see that there are actually captions and time codes for this webinar. So it's a good way to keep track on your webinars. For now, we are just using the Pro, and I'm introducing you guys to the feature, which are more or less similar to the business and enterprise package. But of course, they can do much more. Okay, so moving on, that was for how to schedule and register your own webinar. Just want to briefly talk to you guys about the webinar roles, because I'm sure all of you guys here right now are very interested in what are the roles available and what are the controls available. Early on, I mentioned that in a webinar, you have your host, your co-host, and your panelists. And then you guys in the audiences will be the attendees. So what are the roles and how do they contribute to a successful Zoom webinar? For the host, you can change the role of any panelist and place them into the audience so that they can become a panelist. They join, in a sense, committee right now, and they have the same rights as a panelist. You can also, as the host, provide your panelists remote control. So say, for example, I'm not the only one making a presentation today. Perhaps Indra is making a presentation, or Rayan is making a presentation, or Hafiz is making a presentation. I will then share a remote functions for them to do so. As the host, I can also start and end the meeting for everyone involved here today. So you have your panelists, which is according to the diagram, your host and your co-host, your presenter and your moderators. They have the roles of either providing technical support, event support, or guest speaker. Say, for example, if you're having a webinar today, you want to invite a special guest from NUS or NUH to do a talk on a specific topic, you would send an invite to him as a panelist. So they will, for NLB webinars, the directive is to set them as co-hosts instead of just a panelist, because using co-host privileges, they can then share their own slides, they can have their own webcam. It's a better way for us to keep track of who are on the panelists. So just remember, if you have a guest speaker, just invite them to your webinar and give them the role of co-host. Panelists are able to handle the general audience chat as well. You guys are, if you can check on your clients, if you're coming on a web browser or mobile device, you can see that you have the option to chat. And right now, I have given you guys the option to chat with our panelists. Of course, there's also the option to chat with one another in the audiences, but in generally it's disabled because you don't want people to know who are attending this webinar and you don't want them to chat with each other. As a panelist, we have the privilege to look at the raised hands in this audience, and my co-host here today can enable your mic and audio if you guys wish to speak up. They are also helping me with the social media channel streams, which is Facebook, YouTube, and Workplace. Just something for you to note: if I enables allow to talk for you guys in the attendees, you will be able to enable your microphone now. If we have time today, later, I will play around with some of these roles to enable you guys to become a part of the panelists so they can experience yourself for the controls. But for those of you guys in the audiences right now who are very curious on how it looks like on my end, this is my screen. So this will be the Zoom webinar page that the host sees. I can see, firstly, the participants in this webinar. I can see the general chat log. I can share my screen like a normal Zoom meetings. I can conduct a poll if I so wish. I can record the webinar itself to post-process later. I can bring up the Q&A panel to look at the questions that my audiences are curious about and asking. The closed caption is more of a manual captioning feature in Zoom. I will go into that later. But just to show you guys more information, this is what practice mode allows. If early on, if you schedule your webinar to have the practice mode, you can actually conduct your own Zoom meetings a number of times before you actually go live. So right now, 2:30, we're about 2:50 now. Early on, we broadcasted at 2 p.m. in practice mode. So my team, myself, Indra, Rayan, and Hafiz, we were actually practicing the webinar before we started at 2:30. Once you click broadcast, however, at 2:30, the webinar is live, and then your audiences can start coming in. So right now, this webinar is live. As you can see, the green bar on top is broadcasting to all attendees. Anyone with the invitation can join. The panelists that I've mentioned on the right side, this is where it looks slightly different from your screen. I have a panelist on my left and the attendees on my right. So for today's panelists will be, as I mentioned, the PixelStudio crew, and attendees will be you guys. What I can do here is actually go into the options that I have. I can either mute my co-host, allow my co-host to rename themselves. I can lock the webinar to prevent any more attendees or panelists from coming in. I can even allow my panelists, my co-hosts, my moderators to start their own video. From the beginning, you saw Indra making the introduction. You were able to see his webcam. So these are the features that you can allow your panelists or your co-hosts. What can the host do? The host can also allow you guys to raise your hand and see the participant count. Right now, you can see how many participants are in this Zoom webinar if I allow it. And I can also alter your video layout, whether you want to be following my host view or the active speaker view or gallery view. So there are a number of options that are available to the host themselves. Say, for example, I have a guest attendee for my webinar, which is you guys in the audiences. I can allow you to talk. I can promote you as a panelist to give you the same rights as my community. I can rename or remove you from this meeting. So here is an example of having a guest attendee promoted to a panelist. Once he's on the panel, I can have different options for him. I can either make him the host of this webinar or the co-host. I can change his role back to the attendee, that means effectively demoting him back to an audience. So let's say I promote him to a co-host. So now he shares the same privileges as the co-host, when in fact he was from an attendee of the event. So as a co-host, I can make him the host. I can withdraw his co-host permission. So I've now demoted him back to attendee after withdrawing his co-host privileges and demoting him back to attendee. So it will be as if he just joined in as attendee in the first place. He can't use his webcam. He can't use chat. He can't talk to the audiences. He's effectively coming in as attendee. So you can do this process as many times as you want. Promoting and demoting. It's entirely up to the host. Let's see if we have any question at this point in time. If the questions are asked on YouTube or live, to the host or moderator redirect the questions to Zoom? Okay, so earlier I mentioned you have your moderator, right? So part of your moderator's job will be help redirect these questions on Zoom. As I mentioned before, there is a chat function, and my co-host will be Rayan or Hafiz. They can chat to the host of the event itself, or they can unmute themselves and speak to the presenter or the host or the moderator so that, hey, there are actually questions coming in from a third-party channel. Would you like to address them here? We will move into the Q&A next. This is basically why we are doing this webinar. The Q&A is visible to all panelists. So the whole PixelStudio crew can see your questions coming in. We can also control the audience visibility, which is your visibility on your end. You might be able to see all the questions that have been asked in this webinar, or only the answered questions that have been asked. We have the controls on that. We can also allow you guys to either answer question publicly or privately. Say, for example, you have a sensitive questions that you want, a sensitive question that you want to raise up, but you do not wish to associate your name to that question. There is in fact a checkbox right now, if you can see on your end, to ask this question anonymously. So there will be no way to know if who asked these questions. Of course, there's also voting and comments. If you feel like a particular question that have been asked is a very good questions, it's a very good question to this webinar, you can give it a thumbs up, and then everyone can see it as well. So this is an example of a Zoom webinar that I've attended earlier. I'll just share with you guys. On the right, you can see as an attendee, you can see all the questions that have been asked, and then all the questions that you've asked. So it's neatly split into two, with the left showing all the questions that have been asked, the thumbs up questions, and then those that have been answered by the panelists. So at this point in time, I would like to ask if there's any questions. I can see a question by Anna. By encouraging viewers to register via Zoom, is this considered sharing patron info with Zoom? Okay, so there are a number of customization you can make to your registration form. I'll just briefly show you guys what I created. So as you can see from the ones that you guys use to register for this webinar, I set it compulsory for your first and your last name, your email address, your title and your department, and your staff ID. If you want to amend this information, you can do so by going to your web portal under invitation, right? Edit your registration form. Say, for example, you don't want these questions to be asked. You can just uncheck it. And then if you want to ask a different question, you can say, okay, what is your NRIC, for example? This is how you can create custom questions for your own registration form. Again, if you are not happy with this question for your form, you can just delete it. Of course, you don't have to use this registration form. Say, for example, if you're more comfortable with the traditional ways of forms in SOE, maybe you want to create an event on the NLB event page, you can do so. By doing so, you can just edit your webinar again and removing the the need for registration via Zoom if you are unsure of sharing your information via Zoom. Just as simple as a check mark. I hope that answers your questions, Anna. Another question from Callista. Meetings are susceptible to Zoom bombing. Any risk we should be aware for webinar? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by Zoom bombing, but earlier on I mentioned in the control panel as a host, you can actually go and log the meeting. I'll just bring it up and show everybody. By logging your webinar, no one else can join your webinar. You're essentially closing your doors to the public. So it's a good way to effectively stop anybody else from coming in. All right. Thanks for the questions. Moving on, let's talk about the kind of reports and statistics that you can use for a Zoom webinar. Say, for example, you have done and hosted your perfectly perfect webinar. You want to look at the reports and statistics generated. These are the 4 types of reports that you can use for your Zoom webinar. You can have your registration report if you choose to have a registration process. You can have an attendee report to see the progress of your attendees, performance, and Q&A. So these are the summary reports that I have generated. Over here, you can see how many attended your webinar, how many actually registered, and attendee report shows briefly how long were they engaged in your webinar. Say, for example, you have people coming that stays throughout the webinar. Your webinar is 3 hours. They have stayed throughout the 3 hours. It will be reflected. Otherwise, it will show how long they actually were engaged in your webinar. Maybe half an hour, 1 hour, or the full 3 hours. Another report that I want to share with you guys would be the Q&A reporting. Say, for example, the questions that you raised, your audiences raised up in your webinar, they are all recorded, and you can easily see their questions being asked and the answer to their questions. I'll just briefly go to another webinar that PixelStudio conducted earlier this month. So you can see if I go to my web portal, under the left side column, I go to reports. I go to webinar. I select the type of report that I want. Search for the date of the webinar itself. And then I search. I can see generate report. So this is how you actually get a report of your webinars. By looking at the exported CSV sheets, you can see the entire questions log being asked and the answer that was given to your audiences. So it's a good way to keep track of the stuff that are involved in your Zoom webinars. So go back to the Q&A. Can you explain the engagement part of the report, please? Yes, sure. So let me see all these webinars that I have. I'll generate a different kind of report for your benefit. Then we open it up. Right. So very briefly, you can see the users that are signed in on this webinar and how long that spend in time for the session in minutes. So like I said, if your webinar is 3 hours long, the report will give you an actual depiction of how long they actually took to attend your meeting. So if they were here from the very beginning, it will be 3 hours. If they left halfway in the second hour mark, then it will only be 2 hours. Rosalina asked, for PA, are we able to do the setup, time, date, registration, etc., but release host to our bosses and other stuff? That is a good question. So earlier on, I mentioned that you do need a pro license to schedule a webinar. So if I go back to the scheduling of webinar, you do need a pro license to schedule, so you can talk to all the individual department heads. Say, for example, if you want to assign an alternative host for your webinar, your alternative host must also have a pro license. You can't assign to a normal Zoom account that does not have the pro license. So this is something to note about. However, when you're in the meeting itself, so long as you have broadcasted your event is live, your webinar is live now, and your participants are joining in, you can then release your host rights and co-host rights to these attendees. But of course, as the host of the event, I'll remind you not to release your host privileges so easily. You could make them a co-host, but not necessarily for the host of the events. Okay, from Cindy, can we create a feedback survey form in Zoom? For now, there's no feedback survey form, but of course, if you're talking about Zoom itself, there are a lot of third-party applications for this software. They actually have a marketplace that has over 1,000 apps. You could easily integrate one of these apps to use it as your survey form. Otherwise, you can create your own survey form or create your own polling if you so wish. Early on, I showed you guys for this webinar, I created a very simple poll. So the idea about polls is that you can have any event up to 10 questions per poll and up to 25 polls. So this is my first poll. I asked you guys, were you guys new to a video conference software like Zoom? These are your answers. So if I so wish, I can add more questions if I want to use Zoom for the polling. But for the specific survey form, like Form SG, these are all mediums that you can use outside of Zoom, but not within itself. Okay, for Eric, asking about the security classification level. So earlier on, during the circuit breaker period, I believe TDS sent out a email on Zoom, third-party software conference software like Zoom. So for Zoom, of course, it's only up the way until restricted. This is something that you have to bear in mind. I can provide you the link for the classification if you wish, but it is not for very confidential matters, of course, as seeing that it's out of the SOE. Recommendations to use organization or with external parties. If, say, for example, you are hosting your webinar live through Facebook or social media channel, or even putting out in public, of course, you need clearance from CRD first before you can actually proceed. If you are doing your own normal Zoom meetings, if it's private to you, then there's no need to seek clearance. But if you're involving the public members and you're putting your content out in public, it is best you seek clearance within the right departments. Okay, recording quality is actually a good question, Eric. I would be going to that soon. All right, just bear with me. Okay, so that was it for Q&A reporting. I've shown you guys the type of reports that you can create. There are actually 4 different kinds. If you're interested to know more, I can show you guys later. So for Zoom webinar, there is a function called on-demand video. When you see on-demand, basically, you just have to associate it with having the need for a registration in Zoom for your video. Why do you need on-demand video recording? It's because Zoom offers 2 types of ways for you to save your meetings. You can either do cloud recording or local recording. For the purpose of NLB, we don't advise you to use cloud recording because to have sufficient space, you need a higher tier of subscription. For our current subscription, there are limited spaces. Say, for example, if the departments in NLB, they want to do their own webinars, we are advising you guys to do a local recording. So go under your settings, again on the web portal, check local recording. And then when you start your webinar, record it offline instead of recording to the cloud. So let me just show you on the web portal, under recordings, local recordings. This is a recording of a previous webinar that PixelStudio had conducted. So the resolution, of course, will be high definition. Don't worry about the low resolution. But however, if you do use lower resolution or if you have low latency in your Zoom meetings and they are having troubles projecting at the higher resolution, then that might be similarly reflected in your recordings. But having said that, Zoom will always find the best resolution that they can to provide for you. If you're like me, recording to your local devices, they would also record the audio source separately so that you can have the option to have clearer audio. All right, I hope that answers your questions, Eric. Okay, moving on. So if you guys are interested to know about Zoom, in the slides that will be provided later, you can see there's a whole list of articles on how to conduct an effective Zoom webinar. If you guys want to have additional support in your live webinars events, you can always drop us a mail at NLB Pixel Studio email. so that we can help address the specific needs for your webinar. Just want to briefly go back to the current structure. We do have a little bit of time for you guys to raise further questions, and also have a practice session where I'll give you guys some of the roles as the co-host so they can experience the controls for yourself. The moment I promote some of you guys in the audiences, you would have the ability to see the controls that were mentioned earlier just now, the rights as well. So you can get to experience that for yourself. Okay, let me just stop share for now. Okay, look at my participants list. Let's say, okay, promote Kalista as the panelist. Okay. Now, Kalista is on a panelist. I can promote her as a co-host. So now she's a co-host. Okay. Any more questions coming in from the audiences?
We have one question from Berlin, Roger.
All right.
It's in the chat. She asked whether there's a limit to the number of panelists.
No, there's no limit.
Then there's another one by Pearly as well.
Pearly.
Yeah, you go to the chat.
Okay, wait, let me just bring up my chat. Okay, Pearly asks, can I confirm that PLS Zoom account can do webinar? Okay, chances are if your department hasn't got the rights to the license for Zoom webinar, you will not have the ability to create your Zoom webinar. So in your case, when you go to the web portal, you'll only be able to conduct and schedule your own Zoom meetings. Zoom webinar requires an additional subscription, which I believe Case from TDS can assign to you guys so that you guys can try it out yourself. Oh, there's two Pearly and Pearlin. Sorry, that's the chat to Q&A, but it's not working for me.
We have one question from Aslin.
Yes. Hi, Aslin. Yes. Yes, Hafiz, what's the question?
It's in the chat.
Okay, if I require my participants to interact with each other, for example, small group discussion, yes. In your case, a normal Zoom meeting with the function of breakout will be actually more appropriate for your use case. In the case of a Zoom webinar, you can already tell that the interaction is mostly coming from one side, which is from the panelists. So for group discussion, it's not really an effective channel or medium. All right, I've made a number of attendees today as the co-host panelists. So I hope you guys can see now the differences joining a webinar as an attendee and as a panelist. If you have any more questions, feel free to approach us or raise them from this meeting. Converting meeting to a webinar, Eng Soon. Yes, Eng Soon, I mentioned earlier as well, if you have your own Zoom meeting that you have scheduled, you need the pro license in order to first see the options for a webinar. And if you have the pro license, you can then convert that normal meeting to a webinar. Okay, Qing Li asks, how many co-hosts would you recommend to run a webinar smoothly? How would you delegate the respective roles to co-hosts? That is an excellent question. So I would deviate back to my slides to answer your questions. So just look at this chart. Normally, the host will not be the one making the presentation. The host of the meeting is just to make sure the roles are delegated. Everybody has their own roles. Say, for example, if your webinar have 3 different speakers, your 3 different speakers will have co-host privileges, and they will be the presenters. Ideally, you would also have another co-host, which is the moderator, that will keep track of the meeting take minutes. So on your panelists, you are expecting about five people for three presenters webinar. Anonymous attendee asks, notice that we are live on YouTube. Yep, we are live on YouTube. So if you're live on specific third-party platform like YouTube, for example, there is an option for you to select the privacy before you go live. You can either be unlisted, meaning that you have to provide the link for people to view your video. Public meaning everybody can see it without you having to do anything. Or private, meaning nobody can see it except the people that you allow. So these are dependent on the third-party settings. For example, if it's YouTube, it will be YouTube settings. If it's Facebook, it will be Facebook Live settings. This is not determined by Zoom. Firu asks, what is the current Zoom account that NLB has? So NLBs, we have already purchased, like I mentioned, a couple of Zoom webinar licenses. If you're interested on knowing more, you can drop us a mail at PixelStudio, drop Case from TDS a mail. We'll be able to give you a better oversight of the accounts that we have. So Pertra actually asks, how do you suggest we help participants troubleshoot if they cannot log into Zoom? I assume that you're referring to Zoom conferences, not just webinars specifically. Our volunteer group actually created, I believe it's Lillian's group actually created, they actually created a very nice, simple Zoom introduction slides, how you can troubleshoot and assess, how you can help seniors log into Zoom, how they can download it from the App Store, how they should update to the latest version. So if you need that, we can provide that as a learning materials. But I will assume if you need to educate them, you could do up slides, send them on how to get started with Zoom. It's pretty easy. But yeah, if you wish, we can share the slide with you. Pauline Tan actually asked, if the host drop connection halfway through the session, will the co-host become the host? Host is not the presenter in this instance. So that's why you have an alternative host option. So if I drop connection or if I quit halfway, my assigned alternative host, which is Indra in my case, will become the host of the meeting. And say, for example, if there's no alternative host, the next co-host will become the host. However, if I come back to the session, I actually have an option to select wait, let me find it here under my participants list. Yeah, so say for example, if I was the original host of the meeting and I lost my host privileges because of a drop connection or I lost internet, for example, if I come back to the meeting, I can revoke host permissions to take back my position as host. So as the host of the meeting with a licensed pro account, that option is always available for you. And I asked if we can live stream to IG. For now, I don't see any options, but there is custom RTMP where you can live stream to specific video portal if you have the RTMP link. But for IG Live, I don't think for now there is any way you can do that. All right. Any more questions, guys, from the YouTube page? I have hoped to give you guys a better understanding of Zoom webinar versus a normal Zoom meeting. As always, if you guys have any more questions, you can forward them to us. Is it advisable to host the webinar on your own? You mean like a solo one-man team? It really depends on the scope of your webinar. Say, for example, in our case, for PixelStudio, we are hoping to open it up to the entire NLB. And we're also putting it out on public so that the public people can come in and know about webinars. But say, for example, if you're doing a very small webinar that you have a selected guest list, it's very possible for you to do it on your own. Say, for example, if you're not streaming to live platform, you're only having it for a few people, you can just host the webinar on your own, assign yourself the privilege, maybe one other alternative in case anything happens as your co-host. Yeah, it's very possible. Paylin asks, does this mean our current webinar and YouTube Live is accessible by the general public? Yes, if the YouTube Live is publicly accessible, then the public can access through our NLB PixelStudio page. If it's unlisted, again, that means you can only provide the link to your participants and they can only watch the video once you have given them the link. But right now, yes, it's live. Everyone can see it. We're nearing the end of today's session. Hopefully, we have addressed most of your questions and issues with Zoom webinars. If not, we can provide the slides for today's sessions later on to you guys for you to refer. Just gonna withdraw some of the co-host privileges that I've assigned
You're done with
earlier.
all your the topics?
Yes. Azlin asked.
We have one more question by asking.
Yep, I see Azlin questions. Can the attendee forward the link to another person who did not register? So for our case, if you guys have received a registration link, there is actually a sentence there that says that the link is unique to yourself. So in the case where, like myself, I've set it to have compulsory mandatory registration, you can't actually share the link for somebody to use it to join the webinar unless they register using their own email address. I hope that answers your questions. You have to register if the host sets it as a mandatory registration session. Yep.
Okay.
I don't see any more questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
No more questions.
No more. Okay. Okay, I have good news for you. Okay, for Zoom webinar license, TDS bought the license, and we are happy to all of you use to run your programs. Okay, what you need to do is to drop us an email, and probably we will guide you along to raise how to raise a service request for this. License to you for a limited, basically for you to run your program. After the program, we will get the license and we share with the rest. We know that the PLL has a lot of programs which are applicable to be run online. So use it lah. Christmas comes early. So what you need to do is to have a free Zoom license. You already have now because tuning in. So-called loan the license to you lah. Okay, so we need to put the license to good use. I know very well that you guys run all these programs and it's applicable. Whatever programs that is going to be conducted with the public on Zoom platform, remember this, the classification must be official, but only those, okay? Not like you or if you want to have your internal discussion, just use via NOE, okay? So whenever go out, the content has to be official open, okay? So I hope you guys have tips and tricks on how to run the Zoom webinar session, and please do so. Get in touch with the we can assign the webinar license to you for you to run your programs, as mentioned earlier. So we felt it is essential during this even after the circuit breaker ends, we should programs to make reach to the right people. Also like to know what are the trainings that you would like to. You can send me or the Pixel team an email and we'll try to help as much as possible. And I also like to end off. I like to end.
Sorry, Indra, you are dropping quite a bit. They mentioned that they can't hear you very well.
I think there's.
Indra voice all wobble. Just to reiterate, Indra mentioned that you should only be using Zoom for official open. Yep.
But no content be conducted on still continue to have the
Yes, yes. We will be providing the learning materials from today's session. So don't worry. Maybe Indra, you want to try joining back? Sorry for the latency issues.
yeah something wrong with the network. So anyway, any other more questions you can just email us. Okay. So would you signing out. Bye bye. You can
uh, Thank you guys. We are come to the end of today's session. We'll be providing the materials.
Roger, Reshma has a question on the number of webinar accounts that we have.
I think, like I mentioned earlier, best to approach case.
two
Thank you.
simultaneously concurrent.